It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. We are speaking to you on the eve of Christmas. Not quite the eve, not the 24th, but the 19th of December as we record this. And joining me as usual is Hong Kong Jack. G'day mate, how are you?
Excellent.
That's the way, getting ready for Christmas?
Yes, the town is emptying out a little, as it always does.
And what are your personal plans?
My personal plans for Christmas? A pretty quiet Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. My son and girlfriend are arriving Boxing Day, and my wife returns the day after. So it'll be
you've got a Boxing Day Christmas.
It'll be a Boxing Day Christmas and a Christmas between Christmas and New Year.
Very, very traditional. And you'll be doing the cooking on the Boxing Day?
That hasn't been decided yet. We might go somewhere nice to eat.
Okay, fair enough. And you'll have an eye on the...
We will have all had the traditional Christmas lunch on Christmas lunch, so we might do something different.
But it's just you on your own, or is your lovely wife?
No, I'll be having Christmas evening meal with some American friends.
Oh, well,
Some American friends at a British pub, and it will be the full catastrophe of a British Christmas with roast beef and Yorkshire pudding and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, just perfect. Well, it's cool. It's cool in Hong Kong there. Very humid today in the Highlands. You don't often get the humidity, Sydney's humidity, but we've got it today. It's an overcast day, going to be about 28, and it is a little bit of a struggle with the humidity, but I haven't seen the forecast for Christmas yet. I might just have a look at the BOM, who have received a bit of criticism for not predicting the degree of rain that has befallen Cairns. You must have seen some of the footage there, Jack.
I did, yes. Very wet indeed, even by our standards.
I think it's only 300 millimetres of rain in less than a day at one point, and it hasn't really stopped very much. A mate of mine has been Facebooking the drama, and it looks very, very serious. And I think finally the military are involved and taking people off house roofs. We have a predicted 22 here on Christmas Day, and that involves a bit of rain, a shower or two. So that's not going to be hideously hot. But
it was 9 degrees here yesterday morning, so you know.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's springtime in the Southern Highlands, mate. We take our shirts off when it gets to 10. Breaking news: the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Natasha Fyles, has resigned over conflicts of interest. There are two specific conflicts of interest in shareholdings in mines, undisclosed, and she was, of course, the relevant minister before she became the Chief Minister over mining, and it includes an allegation that she had refused as Health Minister, not Mining Minister, but Health Minister, to investigate suspected heavy metal poisoning of Indigenous Territorians at a manganese mine, which she had a shareholding, Jack. So that is a resignation offence, and if you don't resign, you've got to go anyway.
Allegations, but yes, that's a resigning offence. Well, it's a strange place to
resign. The bit about the clean-up and the connection there is really speculative, but it would seem that she has offered her resignation. Northern Territory politics is a movable feast, Jack, and she did not cover herself in glory throughout her period as Chief Minister. She, if I might be so bold, didn't seem all that bright.
It's a strange place. I think the average around the country for the proportion of employees who are on the government payroll is about 8 or 9%. In the Northern Territory, I think it's 17% plus. So it's a government town, really, or they're two government towns. And that changes the dynamics of how politics works.
They've got an election coming as well. And I think next year they go to the polls. And it's always the way that, it's a little bit like Queensland, that you see an elected government with a fairly significant majority can be swept aside very, very quickly. And then they go through that cycle all over again 4 years later. All right, we'll keep an eye on that story as we go into Christmas, but at the moment, the Northern Territory is leaderless going into Christmas. I don't think that'll bother
They won't notice the
Territorians all that much, Jack.
They won't notice the difference.
No, they'll be into the stubbies and not worry about it too much. In sadder news, Jerry Hand, former member of the Victorian Left and former Indigenous Affairs Minister in the Keating government, has passed away at 81 years of age, Jack.
Yeah, he was my local member, Jerry, and had been a ALP organiser in the hard left days, worked for Cyril Primer, a senator. So he was, and these were the days where factional discipline was enforced, if necessary, with violence. So he'd grown up in hard days and almost beat Bob Hawke for pre-selection for Wills. I think Hawke won by about 10 votes. Right. And then unseated Ted Innes for the seat of Melbourne, which was my local seat, and held that until for quite a long time. I was a minister. I was a Hawke supporter during the Hawke-Keating battles, and was Minister for Aboriginal Affairs for quite a while, and worked very hard at that. And then was Minister for Immigration. And he was the Minister for Immigration when the rule of mandatory detention of unauthorised arrivals commenced. He introduced that.
Yeah. And that was the response. I'm going to say that was around about 1993, Jack.
Yep.
When mandatory detention first came in. Yes, a great figure within the Labor Party, known as the Black Hand, wasn't he?
He was.
A major factional player, but also a very, very clever and pragmatic minister of the Crown.
And a decent man. I can remember at the San Remo Ballroom, Paul Keating standing up and saying he was a fundraiser for the ALP in Victoria, and Jerry had invited Keating down to speak, and Paul got up, buttoned up the Xenia suit and said, if I'd been born in Melbourne and Jerry Hand had been born in Sydney, he'd have been in the New South Wales right and I'd have been in the Victorian left. And there was just uproar around the San Remo Ballroom. It was a great night. So Jerry was the minister. Jerry was the member for Melbourne until he resigned. And then there was a battle between Lindsay Tanner and Julia Gillard for the seat, which Lindsay won. And Lindsay held it then for a time, and now it's a Green seat. And
I was just going to say now,
they'll have a lot of trouble getting it back.
Stopped being a factional plaything for the Labor Party. It's gone to the Greens, and it ain't coming back anytime soon.
In large part, that's because a lot of the old socialists left are now in the Greens.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we talked about this in terms of voting behaviour. It really is. I mean, in terms of stability within the Labor Party, it's brought that along too. But it's also it means that Greens votes in seats that they can't win. Our preferences tend to go to Labor, almost 9 out of 10. So it gives Labor an electoral advantage where the Greens are strong, but not strong enough to win seats.
Yeah, it was a ding-dong battle between Lindsay Tanner and Julia Gillard for the pre-selection, and Lindsay didn't speak to me for about 15 years afterwards because I voted the wrong way, according to him.
Oh, do you get on now, Lindsay?
Yes, that's fine.
Lindsay Tanner moved on from his position at Essendon Footy Club. He pretty much dragged them out of the grave too, by the way.
He's a good man, Lindsay, no doubt about it. And it was an excellent minister.
All right. Now we've got the Leongatha unfolding at the moment. Brittany Higgins' Chief of Staff, Fiona Martin, is giving evidence. The session that's just concluded before lunch was not subject to a live feed. No one could watch it remotely. And in fact, I think lawyers acting on behalf of Fiona Martin actually requested that the courtroom be cleared of all people but media and those directly involved. But the Justice Lee said no to that, and she's given some fairly significant evidence, Jack, this morning, saying that there was pressure placed upon her by her minister, that's Linda Reynolds, and Alex Hawke, who had some involvement in this as the previous minister. They had both instructed her to report this directly to the police, and she declined to do so. She said she feared that she might lose her job by declining to do so. But she wanted to give Brittany Higgins agency over reporting the offence. It doesn't cast when she was asked this morning about why the ministers insisted that she report it to police without the approval of Brittany Higgins, she said she believed that they were doing that. The two ministers were doing this. Hawke and Reynolds were doing this to cover themselves, Jack.
They were exercising their judgment to prevent further damage to the government, I suppose you would say.
That's right, yeah. Which is a completely different set of priorities, isn't it?
I think Fiona Brown exercised her judgment better, myself.
She seems to have been one who's come out of this in very good shape, and also that she seems to have been characterised by the Higgins camp and Brittany in particular as a person who was sort of walked past the allegations that Brittany Higgins made, and that was covered fairly concisely in a piece by Stephen Rice, Ricey for the Australian, where he covered the evidence or testimony given by Lisa Wilkinson, the Channel 10 journalist, who seemed to be giving evidence that I'm not sure that Justice Lee would be all that impressed by, Jack.
No, he wasn't. You and I have talked about the Jack Elliott rule, that is, don't do this sort of thing and don't start suing people for defamation. I would make an exception in the case of Fiona Brown. I think she's a walk-up start.
I can see that, yes. I can definitely see that. So who would she sue, Jack?
As Fiona Brown said...
She would sue Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson if she was of that mind, of course.
Yeah. The worst thing, as Fiona Brown correctly said, the worst thing you can say about a woman is she walked past another woman's rape. And that's effectively what Channel 10 were accusing her of. And I think, she's got a good claim against Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson.
Yes, it would seem so if she decides to go down that path. And it must be said, too, that Fiona Brown has suffered. She was a Liberal Party staffer, so she was a party appointee. She's not a bureaucrat. And that she suffered significant trauma as a result of these claims,
which would be a good reason not to sue. That's true.
Yes, and there has been a fair amount of care extended to her while she's given her testimony, because there is a realisation that she's suffered significantly as a result of this sort of saga unfolding. You've seen most of the evidence, Jack. We've had the Channel 10 executives. We had the Channel 10 doyen of news and current affairs, Peter Meakin giving evidence now. He's 81, I think, 81 or 2, giving evidence as well. We've seen Lisa Wilkinson give evidence. We don't want to push too far and cross the boundaries of sub judice, but Where do you think this is going to fall, Jack?
Well, we're a little bit safe because there's not a jury involved. What do I think? Well, I think Bruce Lemon needs to prove, firstly, that he was defamed, and to prove that, he needs to prove that he was identified sufficiently in the story. And then he has to, then Channel 10, if they want to defeat that, have to prove either truth or qualified privilege. Where do I see it in a nutshell? I think he gets up on the defamation. I think there's enough identification to get him up there. I think they lose on the truth, and qualified privilege is really hard to get up. And I think on balance, probably he wins.
Okay, well, we'll see. I'm not quite sure when the judgment is due, and there may be no date. But it would be, I suspect, probably around March or April of next year.
Could be. I thought Peter Meakin did a fair bit of damage to their qualified privilege defence yesterday.
Explain that, please.
Well, in layman's terms, for the qualified privilege defence to get up, you've got to show that it's in the public interest, and you've done a really good job with the journalism. And he was critical of some aspects of how it was done. And I think that's a fair bit of damage done to it.
All right. Well, I just want to dwell briefly on Lisa Wilkinson's evidence, Jack. This is just quoting from Ricey's article. Let's leave aside the program's failure to reveal it was Brown and Reynolds who urged Higgins to go to the police. That would seem now to be not quite the case. Reynolds, yes. Reynolds actually instructed Brown to go to the police without the permission of Brittany Higgins. And he goes on to write, consider instead Wilkinson's claim that this was an example of Brown being portrayed as nice because she gave her a brochure and told her to have the afternoon off, I should say. And counsel said, that's your answer? And Wilkinson, yes, that's a caring gesture, not a callous one. How is taking the afternoon off a callous gesture, Wilkinson asks. Well, perhaps because a boss telling a woman who has just claimed to have been raped not to go to the police or a doctor or a counsellor, but to take the afternoon off would be about as caring as it gets, Ricey says. Yeah, there was, shall I say the word obfuscation in Wilkinson's testimony, Jack?
I think that would be fair.
Look, we've been watching it. I think the numbers are in the sort of 40,000s over the last few days. There will be a judgment made next year.
Can we advertise the two Jacks on the feed? So if there are 40,000 people watching, someone should be monetising this.
No, you can't. And in fact, there was a sort of men's rights organisation that was getting onto the feed, making all sorts of comments there. Yeah. And Justice Lee has demanded the identity of those people involved in that. So, yes, the answer to that, Jack, is no, we can't.
And that won't go well for them, which is why I was suggesting
it will not go well at all once their identities are revealed.
Justice Lee has asked for them to appear and show cause why he should not have them charged with contempt of court.
Ooh, yeah, they might be having a change of Christmas plans, those individuals, Jack.
Yeah, bring a toothbrush.
All right, when we speak of Christmas, who's going to enjoy it more, Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton?
I think Dutton will.
There's been a lot of reporting suggesting that certainly Simon Benson's reporting in the Australian suggesting that Albo is a heavy weight on Labor support, but Labor goes into Christmas in front in polling. There was one other poll released last week, earlier this week, just going off some of the psephologists that I follow, which had it at 50-50. And that was corrected on 2PP to 50.3 for Labor. That'd be very, very close. But as it stands, Labor's primary votes in the Redbridge poll is at 33, which is low. That's low, and it gives them a 2PP if we want to extrapolate that, and it's always controversial, just on 53% of 52.8. So the party seems to be going okay. I mean, when we say okay, you've got to qualify it by saying that these are very difficult times. I mean, it's always the economy stupid, and cost of living pressures and inflation, interest rate hikes, for no great benefit, it must be said, have really reduced people's spending.
The reason I think that that Dutton might have a slightly better Christmas is that his job at the start of the year was to put Labor, the coalition back in a sort of a competitive position. And I think he has done that. He sort of, set out what he needed to do at the beginning of the year. He's achieved that. Labor would still win an election if it were held anytime soon. The two-party preferred vote is about the same as it was at the last election. So they probably get much the same, perhaps a little worse. Worst case scenario is they have to govern with a few Green supports, but they're going to win the next election, most likely. That wasn't Dutton's job. It was almost going to be impossible for him to win an election.
Yeah, they haven't gone backwards. So if we look at 2007 when Rudd came to power, it was an absolutely disastrous 18-month period for the coalition. They started off with Brendan Nelson. We call that the Nelson months. And then he was rolled by Malcolm Turnbull, and then Turnbull himself was rolled. They really just got involved in a fair amount of knifing and bad blood. So they haven't done that, haven't lapsed into that mistake.
So Dutton's provided some stability and a bit of spine in the coalition. So I think he's done I don't think he's going to become a prime minister, but I think he's done a pretty good job with what he had to do. And on the other side, if you're Anthony Albanese, you look back over the last 12 months and you say, well, I handled the Voice very, very badly. And I've been hit by the economy. They're the two things that have done most damage.
Well, and look, it must be said, a lot of the economic stuff is beyond the control of governments, regardless of who's in power, because of external forces, because of the post-pandemic period where there was a lot of consumer spending, a lot of money in bank accounts sitting around to be spent. And then we had things like the invasion of Ukraine, restrictions on energy, all sorts of issues like that were always going to be difficult for governments in this country to handle. The Voice was a bit of a disaster, and I suspect that's what Elbo's being judged on at the moment. And Dutton is probably the beneficiary of, well, I'm not crazy about Elbo.
A little bit of that. The problem with the Voice was it was a mistake made at the top, and that will be a little not a millstone round Elbo's neck, but it's going to be a weight he's going to have to carry for the rest of his political career.
Yeah. Okay. What was he doing in Margaret River, Jack?
The social media and the newspapers were full of stories about Elbo having a sip of a $500 bottle of wine at Cullen Wines in the Margaret River, and there was a great deal of outrage about this.
Where from?
So where from? Well, from your brothers and sisters in the nasty Murdoch press, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, look, and you got to understand that sort of clickbaity stuff. It's not really an issue of any great substance. It's like perhaps other media having a pop at Morrison because he was the water boy in a rugby game and had his trousers on with stains all over them and fly half undone. But yeah, those are the sorts of things. It's a little bit like the Airbus Elbo nonsense, right? As if prime ministers shouldn't be travelling ever, and that's just a bit of nonsense, really. The real issue is the economy. If with the MyFO, there is perhaps an optimism about, and perhaps an unfounded optimism that inflation will go back to within the AR or the Reserve Bank's proposed ban, between 2 and 3% in the next 12 months. And that would take a lot of heat away from the government.
Yeah. More importantly, on wine news, Australia is swimming in a wine lake. There are about 2 billion bottles worth of wine sitting in casks, unable to be sold. This is a terrible problem.
What have we got going on there, Jack? I mean, look, most of Australia's wine, I know this because I did a fair bit of research into the wine industry a number of years ago, is sold to Sweden to be used as a biofuel.
So it's sold
as a biofuel to Sweden.
Yeah.
And sort of that took up about 70% of production. Now, it may well be that Sweden doesn't need the biofuels that it once needed. Is that the problem?
The wine market in China collapsed for two reasons. One, that the Chinese whacked huge tariffs on it. But even before that happened, the crackdown on corruption, as it was styled by President Xi Jinping, was stopping a lot of the banqueting where good wines were swished down the throat.
Too bourgeois, Jack. Too bourgeois. But it must be said the Chinese market for wine is relatively small compared to Japan, for example, the United States. Still relatively small. So it would seem to me, without having a good, long, hard look at this in recent times, that there is a great overproduction of wine, Jack. Too many grapes.
Yeah, they should put a fair bit of it in bottles and send it up here.
Or you can start your car with it, Jack.
I'm a green type of chap. I don't have a motor car.
I know, we know that, but you could swing it to your taxi driver and say, chuck that in instead of petrol. See how you get on. In the United States, Rudy Giuliani is $148 million US dollars poorer, or so it would seem, after he's been ordered to pay that to two women that he made false claims about, that they tampered with votes. The two women were Georgia poll workers, Ruby Freeman, and her daughter, Wandrea Shea Moss, and they have spoken about how devastating Giuliani's lies were, and basically had to go into hiding and still have difficulty holding themselves up in public. They're each awarded $16 million for emotional distress. The jury ruled. Another payment of $75 million in punitive damages, these are all US currencies, was ordered to be split between them. They had originally sought between $15 and $43 million in damages from Giuliani, but got a fair bit more than that. Now, Giuliani has said that he will appeal, but he's still going to be slugged with a fair, and that $148 million figure might come down, but he's still going to be slugged with a fair amount of dough that he may not have, Jack.
It's not uncommon for these jury verdicts to be reduced on appeal, but it's almost certainly going to be more than Rudy has.
They had the big fundraiser. He popped down to Mar-a-Lago and said, Donald, can you help me out? He goes, sure, mate, I'll turn up to the fundraiser, which I think was $1,000 a plate dinner. So that may not be enough to get him out of strife. And, of course, he's still in a fair bit of strife in Georgia, and may well be facing other criminal indictments. He's also, I think, just to add to his woes, and they are significant, it's New York where he's been disbarred. I think
so, yes.
And he's also required to show cause in, I think, DC and possibly another state as to why he shouldn't be struck off there too.
I don't think that's going to trouble him. I can't imagine there'll be a queue around the block wanting him as their lawyer.
Rudy, mate, I've got a bit of a problem, Rudy. Can you represent me in court? Yes, I don't think that is going to be a problem, but it just adds to his woes considerably. Yes, he's fallen a large distance from his time when he was a prosecutor in New York and brought the five families to their knees, Jack.
Oh, even more dramatically from
9/11.
He was universally, pretty universally admired for the job
America
he did as mayor of New York after 9/11.
And going on now with the Washington indictments, this is the 4-count indictment that Trump is facing with a trial set for March 4, which is right slap bang in the middle of the Republican and Democrat primaries.
I think it's the day
and
before.
that may well be a bit delayed now, Jack.
It's the day before the Iowa primaries. I think it was due to start.
No, March 4. No, Iowa is a caucus, but no, that's a bit earlier. So I think it would start sort of a week before, or maybe a few days before Super Tuesday. So we're right in the guts of it. Anyway. It would seem that now might be delayed because the special counsel Jack Smith has called upon the Supreme Court to make a finding on whether presidents can be convicted of offences that they commit in office.
Yes, and I wouldn't be game enough to hazard a guess as to how they might find on that.
Don't ask me either, but it has been a bit of a push ever since the Watergate years. With a group of mainly Republicans who maintain that, like Trump says, that a president can, if we quote Nixon, if I say it as president, it's not illegal. If I do it as president, it's not illegal. So that's going to be a really significant determination by the SCOTUS. And it may well, in fact, delay those proceedings that are scheduled to begin on March 4.
Yeah, it's as I understand it, very uncharted waters in American constitutional terms. So no one really knows where it's going to go.
It's something that needs to be sorted out because, as I said, it's been a running sore ever since Watergate. You know, whatever a president does, no matter how bloody terrible it was, it can't be illegal. It's probably worth remembering and reminding listeners that when Nixon was indicted, it was going to go through the Senate, and it would have got through the Senate. He would have almost certainly been
impeached rather than indicted.
Did I say sorry? Yes, I meant to say impeached, and that he would have been convicted in the Senate. The numbers were not looking good for him at all. And one of the terms of the impeachment was the illegal invasion of Cambodia. And that sort of dropped off the news considerably because it was all of a sudden it was about Watergate and the tapes and all this sort of stuff. And it would have been nice to have the determination on that because, of course, America cannot go to war without congressional approval, Jack.
Yeah, I doubt that would have got up if it ended up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but he would have been convicted. I mean, there's no doubt about it. That's why he resigned, and Ford decided to. General Jerry Ford, he was kind of a likeable guy in many ways, and he used to play golf, Jack, long after his retirement as POTUS, and he used to tell people on the greens, he said, I'm going to hell for pardoning Nixon. I know I'm going to hell. As a joke. But there you go. Now, polling in the States, and just when you think it can't get any worse for Joe Biden, it does. And Trump it seems to be perhaps not skating ahead, but he is well and truly ahead in key battleground states. Last week, one poll had him 10 points ahead in Michigan, which is I find hard to believe. But anyway. Trump now leads in a Rasmussen report. Trump now leads Biden by 10 points, 48 to 38. Only got 86% there, Jack.
That's a 4-point turnaround. A month ago, Biden was leading by 4 points. So it's a big turnaround. I mean, you'd be waiting for the next poll to be sure that's true. But I think it's fair to say that if you were setting a book today, Trump would be favourite.
Yes, I think that's fair. I'd ask you a question too. There was an op-ed written in Politico during the week that said, that went along these lines, that the indictments that Trump will face next year, let's presume the trial goes ahead in March 4 and he's convicted, that Democrats have been thinking that would be a boon for them. And this particular op-ed was suggesting that it might swing a small percentage of voters, but not many. And I think that's probably pretty right too.
I don't think Trump was going to be the nominee, let alone be president, until he was indicted. I think the Democrats have indicted him back into the race, and may well indict him back into the White House.
Well, the only problem with that is, Jack, that it's not the Democrats who brought the indictments. It's the state of New York, it's the state of Georgia, and the Department of Justice. Now, you have to say, on balance, his behaviour in and around January 6th was so awful that there really had to be some consequences there.
Yeah,
But-
and they could have chosen to indict him with really simple offences like inciting a riot, and they did not do that. The charges in New York are a nonsense. The charges in both Georgia and Washington are too complicated and rely on RICO-style indictments. The only charges that are straightforward are the ones in Florida.
Not in the DC. Certainly Georgia, but not in DC. I mean, here we've got a suggestion that he was going to basically transplant the Electoral College with people who were going to vote him in. I mean, it was a concerted effort to swing the election away from the will of the people.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. What I'm saying, as a political matter, they've put him back in the race, and they may well put him back in the White House. Yes, I understand that it was done in New York and Georgia and the Department of Justice, but the Department of Justice is part of the executive. There is no fourth arm of government. The Department of Justice comes under the authority of President Biden. And he could have stopped these at any one time he liked, and they didn't do that, and that's put Trump back in the race.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see about all of that next year. It promises to be just a staggering.
I'm going to say that the interesting thing about the Rasmussen polling was that they polled the three-way matchup: Biden, Trump, and Robert Kennedy Jr. And that was 40% Trump, 32 for Biden, and 16 for Kennedy. And Kennedy's gone up about 4 points. So he's clearly picking up part of the Biden vote.
I don't know about that, Jack. I honestly don't. I mean, obviously, there's a fair amount of crossover there. I suspect where most of the vote for RFK Jr. is coming from is from the Republican base.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Interestingly, Trump now leads Biden with younger voters and women. That's really strange. That Trump's in front of women.
There's a lot that's very strange about it.
And among independents, Trump is beating Biden 52-30.
Yeah, there's clearly a fair amount of unhappiness with the Biden presidency, and I think that's mainly what we're looking at here in terms of polling. We're still a year out. I saw Trump speak the other day where he said that, there are actually some good economic stories for the Biden government to tell. They're just not very good at telling them. And Trump declared those as that they were running on the fumes of the Trump presidency. The good economic news came that way, and then suggested that if he didn't win the next election, that's Donald Trump didn't win the next election, there would be a depression the like of which we haven't seen since 1929. And I just look at that and go, I mean, look, we know that Trump's broken virtually every rule in the political book, but I mean, this is a guy who's running around saying that the country is almost beyond redemption unless he's elected. And I just think that's a message that just will not resonate. We'll see. It's going to be a huge year in American politics. Now over to Israel and Gaza. Haven't we had enough there yet, Jack? Isn't it time for the Americans to tap the Israelis and say, well, look, I don't know where you're going with this. You say you want to root out, the terrorists, and really, what you're probably doing at the moment is creating a whole new generation of them.
Well, I don't think that's worrying the Israelis too much, because they know what they face. 75% of Palestinians support Hamas and continue to support Hamas even after the October 7 atrocities. So how many more are they going to make? Well, it won't make much difference. What they've got to do is destroy Hamas. The key relationship that I keep an eye on is what are Israel's Arab neighbours doing about this, because they all want Hamas gone and they're remaining silent and supportive. So I think that indicates to me that the campaign by Israel is going pretty well.
All right. Now, there was a piece in The Australian by Alan Howard, Jack, who said, things could have been so different for Gaza. There were proposals for its development that might have seen it on the trajectory that powered Singapore to economic prosperity after 1965. Now, I like Alan, Jack, but that's just nonsense, isn't it? I mean, it's just absolute rubbish.
I don't know that it is nonsense. I think it's an exaggeration.
Let me walk you through it, okay? Singapore has a port, doesn't it? It's a very, very busy port. It takes millions of tonnage every year. I could give you the figures. Gaza has a port too, doesn't it, Jack? But it has been blockaded by the IDF since 2007.
Yeah, Israel
so it can't be used.
Israel
and there's lots of reasons for that. And it's not all Israel. I mean, it was blockaded because Hamas was trying to bring weapons through the port. Yeah. So as the port stands now, because of this almost perpetual conflict, it can only take. It's never been a dugout, no infrastructure work done by Hamas, blockaded by the IDF. And it's really just a port for small fishing craft, Palestinian fishing craft. So they just don't have the infrastructure,
They could have had the infrastructure. They have been given more money for a city that size than the Americans ever gave anywhere in Europe for the Marshall Plan. The difference is they have chosen to use it to wage war rather than to build a city.
I agree with that. And I totally agree with that. That basically what they should have been doing, rather than thinking about rather silly false equivalences like Singapore and Gaza, what we should be saying is that the Palestinians had a choice to develop Gaza, to try and enrich themselves to the point where they could start building schools, start educating their young, build hospitals, build infrastructure, social infrastructure for Gaza, and they chose instead to build tunnels and import missiles from Iran and Syria.
Yeah, I don't know whether Singapore is an exact crossover, but I thought Howe was making a good point. The Gazans could have built another Tel Aviv, and they chose not to.
Yeah, they made their choices. That's right. That's just the point I was making. On our Christmas broadcast, they are the architects largely of their own misfortune. We've got essentially a majority. You said 75. I wouldn't put it as high as that. In terms of support for Hamas.
That was from the Ramallah-based Arab World for Research and Development. So not my figures, but theirs.
Yeah, I think that's a little high. We've got 57% of Gazans expressed a somewhat positive opinion of Hamas, as did 52% of Palestinians on the West Bank. So whether we want to quibble about numbers, the issue is that the majority of Gazans, Palestinians generally, support Hamas. And that is, it's going to bring more and more heartache. My issue with all of this is that it will just become another multi-generational conflict that ultimately can never be resolved. It must also be said, and we started this year with 500,000 people on the streets of Tel Aviv every weekend throughout the month of January, calling for Netanyahu to go. And given Netanyahu's political problems, and these were all firmly understood by Hamas, then the attack on October 7 was a deliberate attempt not just to massacre innocent civilians and take others hostage, but to launch a propaganda and use essentially these people, be they Israelis or Palestinians in Gaza, and use them as pawns in a propaganda war. that I would say they've done fairly well at, Jack, Hamas.
It won't change the situation on the ground in Israel at all. I would expect...
But a propaganda war throughout the West, Jack.
Yeah, but Israel will listen to the West, but they're not going to... The West views, people marching in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and London are not going to change Israelis' views about this. The Israelis are absolutely united about getting rid of Hamas. There's just no doubt about that.
I understand the argument. What I'm saying to you is that Hamas understood the dynamic when they plotted and executed the October 7 massacres. And that they knew that Netanyahu would respond with overwhelming force, and that would necessarily lead Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to basically invoke what is a propaganda war that I would suggest they're winning in the West.
They might be winning at the moment, but Netanyahu's going to go after this is all over anyway.
I hope so.
Yeah, and the reason he'll go is that there was an intelligence failure, and the person at the top always goes. Golda Meir's career ended following the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, but and then when we look at the sort of the extension of this war, and I understand that the objectives just seem so murky. The destruction of Hamas. Well, I mean, what does that mean? How is that going to be conceived? And given the desperation of Netanyahu, that this may become far more protracted than it actually should.
I don't think that Netanyahu's making those decisions on his own. I think they're doing a pretty good. All the tells for me suggest they're doing a pretty good job of what they're doing, and the question's going to be what replaces Hamas in Gaza. Certainly the UN should have no role whatsoever in it. They've blotted their copybook. They've emerged from this as a disgrace.
Well, what we saw during the week, Jack, was and the Israelis acknowledged that 2 IDF members were killed, 2, I think, half colonels. Were killed, and then we saw footage from funerals where there are a lot more IDF members who were being buried, sadly, and so again they need to be more open about what's going on and whether they're actually really struggling in.
Like I say, watch what their Arab neighbours are saying about it. And at the moment, it's nothing.
It's not the point. It's not the point. You've made that point before, and it is a reasonable one. What I'm saying to you is, what they don't want to get into is bogged down into a stalemate position because of the directions that people like Netanyahu are giving the IDF.
Yeah, I don't think they are being bogged down. There you go.
Well, they had a lot more funerals than they were actually declaring as casualties, Jack. All right. In the UK, well, they're talking about political basket cases. The Tories in the UK, they are dead men and women walking politically. But that's not what we're doing today. Apparently, there's a brouhaha about carbonara, spaghetti carbonara, Jack.
There is. At a London restaurant called Bottega Prelibato, they've been getting a lot of complaints because they make their carbonara with guanciale, the pork cheek bacon sort of thing, pecorino cheese, egg yolks, and that's all that goes in it. And I happen to agree with that. That's all it should go into it, although you can use pancetta instead of guanciale. But people have been demanding cream and chicken and all sorts of things in their spaghetti carbonara, and the restaurant has given up and said, we're just not going to take it off the menu because we don't want to have the argument.
Can I simply debunk the myth that carbonara is not an Italian meal? It's actually been created in non-Italian, in Italian restaurants, but not in Italy, in the UK, for example, where it's sort of the bacon and eggs, or just the eggs, of pasta. But yes, it's not an intrinsic. I only know this because I heard an Italian restaurateur talk about it, and he said it's not an intrinsically Italian dish.
Well, the Romans would disagree with that. They think they invented it.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to get involved in that.
But
COVID inquiry, Jack, in New Brunswick.
But just before we leave that, it's a tricky question, because if we're all supposed to follow, well, the Romans make it this way, therefore we're all supposed to follow what the Romans do if we do something like this. What do we do about the fact that Italians would say you should never have a cappuccino after 11 o'clock or a latte after 11 o'clock?
Well,
are we all supposed to follow that as well?
You just ignore that, Jack. You don't have it's not a diktat. It's not something that you have to worry about. You can, if you don't want to make your carbonara a certain way, you can do it another way. Yes, you can throw in some bacon.
And I agree with you for a change.
COVID inquiry in New Brunswick. What's all this about, Jack? The Department of Health, this is in New Brunswick. Ooh, there's a New Brunswick. The Department of Health was unable to provide evidence-based documentation to substantiate 33 public health decisions made during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another glance through the review mirror. The audit covered key operational areas that were meant to reduce the spread of COVID-19, including testing, contact tracing, contact management, and infection prevention and control guidance. Auditor General of New Brunswick said the department had numerous systems and procedures in place and were designed to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and went above and beyond to support New Brunswickers. But he found areas for improvement should the need arise.
This is one of the first inquiries that's actually gotten to, and there's been a number of COVID inquiries into how governments reacted to it. This is one of the first ones that said has addressed what I think is the issue of going back and saying, okay, you made decisions on things like testing, contact tracing, contract management, infection prevention, control guidance, all that sort of stuff. What did you base those decisions on? And what he's found is they didn't really have any data to back them up. That doesn't surprise me much, but that's a really good question to ask. What was the process you went through to make those decisions? So there's a big COVID inquiry in the UK. They're not asking that question at all. And it's probably easier in New Brunswick.
Yeah, I understand. You made the point, and I think it's a really sound one, that governments were making decisions in hours that required months, and if not years, to make under normal circumstances. So the answer is the data wasn't there in any substantial way. And if we talk about 2020, the period of almost 12 months before the arrival of COVID around the world into Europe, Italy smashed, UK smashed, in that pre-vaccine period, the world had to act as best they could, and isolation and lockdowns and those sorts of things, contact tracing, which proved to be a bit of a failed thing, very difficult, particularly in Victoria. They had a lot of problems with it. Very difficult, all that sort of stuff. And I just think the term abundance of caution was used. I mean, we look at this now and think, COVID, I got COVID last week. We forget things like the Delta. We forget things like the Delta strain that absolutely smashed India. And for at least a good 18 months of the pandemic, there was no widespread vaccination.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable question to ask. Why did you make that decision? What was the basis for your decision? I don't think this is a matter of hounding people down for getting it wrong, but I think we ought to ask ourselves, okay, there was no data, so what did you use to make that decision? What was the basis for this?
Basic rules of infection control, Jack. Those were the things that were used.
Well, that should be explained. People should be, people who made the decision should be asked to say,
I think it was.
Why? Why did you do it?
I think it was. You needed to reduce the amount of human contact to reduce the spread of the virus.
Good. Then people can stand up and make the argument, but that's what should happen. New Brunswick's a very large geographial, but a small population state. So that's probably why this is able to be done. It's the bit of Canada that's next to Maine, in the northeast of continental America. But I actually think this is the question that the COVID inquiry should be about. I understand why they're not. And that's because, say in the UK, 93% of British voters backed the first lockdown, 71% back the second one, and no one wants to be told that there was all for nothing. But that's the question that needs to be asked for the future.
Yeah, well, it might surprise you, and oddly enough, it hasn't appeared in your notes. There has been an epidemiological study of Sweden's approach, which obviously didn't have lockdowns. They had high rates of mortality, higher than any other country in Europe, and largely those mortality rates were driven by elderly people. And then, of course, the sort of committee that they had were passing on nonsense information.
My view of that is let's put it all on the table and have.
Well, it has been put on the table. This is a significant study. This is a significant epidemiological study by the Karoska Institute in Stockholm, and the findings are there for all to see. That the people, the government actually in Sweden, basically hand-passed this to a committee of epidemiologists and so forth who went pursuing this sort of herd, the herd immunity side of things, which would have been utterly devastating if they hadn't pulled it up, because we were dealing with Delta variants and other variants that were killing people in large numbers. So what we saw there is, yes, an absolute failure of public policy in Sweden. I mean, there are a lot of conservatives and anti-lockdown people who continue to tout Sweden's response as being the ideal, but it wasn't the ideal. It was a long way from it. There was higher rates of mortality in Sweden than any other country in Europe, by far heaps further than ours. And then, of course, there were lies and mistruths told by this sort of committee of management about the potential spread of COVID at the time. So, those things have been examined now. I mean, why wouldn't Sweden have a substantial inquiry into their own government, not an epidemiological institute, but why wouldn't their own government now want to have an inquiry into it?
Yeah, I think they should as well.
Yeah,
but I think that, but I think we should have proper COVID inquiries in Australia, for instance, and we have.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with it, but too often these things can become lapse into sort of finger pointing exercises, and that's not what we want. What we want is to get a base of information so we can plan for the next pandemic with increased global population, human population, and increased movement across continents. Pandemics are going to become more frequent. The issue is not dealing with the next pandemic in much the same way as we dealt with COVID. So the abundance of caution argument is the best way to stop an infectious disease that you know very little about and have very little data about is to reduce human contact, reduce the amount of human contact. I mean, I remember doctors in the UK, and this is in March of 2020, April of 2020, they had no way of dealing. They had no way of treating people. They were really scrambling, and people were dying left, right and centre. They had no way of determining what it was because they knew it was essentially a pneumonic. But they had no idea about what antivirals they could use, and they can't use people as guinea pigs. They were really locked into a very, very bad situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need a proper inquiry in Sweden and elsewhere, and including in Australia, as to why people made decisions. Put them in the box and say, okay, you didn't have much data. We understand that. Tell me why you made the decision.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just think that becomes an exercise that shall we say, plays into the hands of people. If it becomes accusatory, and then it becomes one of these idiotic things that people in the end will go, oh, I don't know, and still say to this day, I don't know why we got vaccinated, and doesn't stop you from getting COVID. And well, mate, yes, it does reduce your symptoms, and it reduces your transmissibility over a period of time, and your transmissibility, the intensity thereof. I mean,
Yeah, well, I'm quite happy for that to go in the witness box, and to have that to have people that
well,
like
we
that
already
put in
had
the
that,
witness box
Jack,
and
because
have them
in the
explain it
European
as well.
Union, one member of the Parliament there asked this leading question of a Pfizer executive, which has now been taken as a truth, and that was, oh well, she was asked, did you create the Pfizer vaccine for COVID to reduce transmission? And she said, well, no, and that was that. Now there was an add-on to that answer, of course, that it wasn't about reducing transmission, because finding a vaccine that would reduce transmission was going to take a lot longer than the world had. But none of that was allowed to be, and instead we were told, oh well, the vaccine was kind of pointless.
Yeah, well,
And now we've got COVID still in our societies, right? Still in our societies, people in high risk situations who are going, oh well, I don't have to worry about it because it's only COVID.
well, let's put all this in front of an inquiry and find out what the right answer is.
I'm just not sure what the benefit of that would be. I understand there are various state governments who are going to be a bit cautious about all of that, because governments don't tend to make decisions in a few hours that they would normally take months or years to take. I'm quite forgiving of all of that, and the abundance of caution. If we had have gone, let's just let it roll in this country, when we look at our mortality rates, when we look at our statistics, we did pretty well. We did pretty well in the Spanish flu outbreak in 1920 as well. We actually did quite well. It was a bit, there was chaos and catastrophe all over the place. There were states being locked down, the same as happened in 2020, 100 years later. But in the end, our mortality rates were low compared to the rest of the world. And that's maybe we just benefit because we're a great stonking island. But look, even the things that I question right now in regard to, locking our ports down so no one could come in and go or leave without special dispensation. I think, again, while that was a mistake and there weren't proper resources to deal with it, I still think, the decision was made in the best interest of the Australian people.
Well, I don't think making a decision in the best interests gives you a blanket approval. I think that these things should still be subject to inquiry.
So what do you want? People in a box,
always be cautious of people who are acting in your best interest.
And
they're the most dangerous people in the world.
And council there want to make a name for themselves, and it just becomes a scapegoating exercise, doesn't it?
Well, I can tell you the Brits are running an inquiry, and their inquiry seems to centre on which special advisor said what to what minister. And really, that's a nonsense. Special advisors should be seen, or not even seen. They should have nothing to do with it. They are just advisors.
Yeah, fair enough. But they can give evidence. But it did include Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, and Boris Johnson, basically very strongly of the position that we should just let it roll.
I don't think the inquiry says that at all.
Well, Rishi Sunak was certainly saying to let it roll. Boris Johnson was certainly saying to let it roll. I think it's on his killing old people, isn't it?
That was a quote from a WhatsApp message, I think. Yes.
Oh, well, most of them were lost. You see, Jack. Boris, he can't conceive how it happened, but all of his messages have disappeared. All right, what was the biggest story of 2023? Gee, there's a few you missed out here, Jack. The ongoing war in Ukraine, the referendum in Australia you've got there. Yes, I think that's probably the biggest domestic political story of the year, and it was a complete unmitigated disaster for the Labor government. Israel and Gaza will be resonating through. One thing we can feel fairly safely about is that it will be running in 2024, and we might actually have it on our what was the biggest story of 2024. What were your big stories, Jack?
I think the referendum was certainly the biggest story in Australia, but is it the Ashes?
Well, I'll go left field. I think the story that's going to run for years, literally years, and possibly centuries, is the alleged mushroom poisonings in Leongatha. That is a story I noticed. It was broken by the Australian, by the one and only John Ferguson, good mate of mine, and Ferg got an award at the News Awards where he got up and said, "This story will outlive me." And I'm absolutely certain he's right. It will be a story that will keep us mystified and intrigued for years to come, regardless of outcomes in court cases.
Yeah, it's got a few of the elements that made the Lindy Chamberlain story so good. These are difficult things to prove.
All of that, but unlike the Chamberlain era, now we have this intense fixation on true crime. We should be doing a true crime podcast, Jack. That our numbers would go through the roof because, that there is this fascination about crime in particular. So when we look at the big podcasts, just as an example, the true crime stuff appears near the top. So there's a fascination about that. There's been some extraordinary cases in the United States as well. So we haven't yet had the true crime potties bring themselves to Leongatha, but it will happen, and people will be mulling over this for a long period of time. I've spoken to a lot of people who aren't particularly newsy, who don't follow politics and so forth, and they're completely entranced by this story.
So are you going to be the John Bryson and go down to the Morwell County Court and watch this piece by piece and write a book about it?
I doubt they'll be doing it at Morwell, mate. I think that'll be in the Supreme Court in Melbourne. But look, it will be a fascinating case.
Court number 1, I expect.
I think it's going to need a big room. Look, it is one of those big true crime stories, and I was fairly close to it. We did see a story unfold when I first spoke to Ferg, who broke the story. I knew it was going to be big. I knew it was going to be huge, but I didn't actually understand just how big it was going to be. Huge international coverage for this too. So going to be the world's media will be turning up in the Supreme Court in Melbourne in a date yet to be fixed in 2024.
On a personal level, the referendum was the biggest story for me because I copped so much flack for saying that it would fail.
You were absolutely right in the end, and I think your figures or your projections for how badly it would fail were found to be right. It was a disaster for the Albanese government. It gets to these issues around communication, and really it was a story that it was a potential constitutional change that might have benefited from an open discussion with the Australian people, not just this year, and certainly not in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, but going back several years.
Yeah. And US politics at the moment, look, it's just the best entertainment, isn't it, really?
Well, 2024, I mean, if you tried to predict the outcomes, it's just completely unpredictable. I mean, and it runs from Trump being jailed but still a presidential candidate, Trump being elected while in jail, I mean, and pretty much everything in between. The possible tapping of Joe Biden, I suspect that can happen all the way up to the DNC in June, July.
I think it's August in Chicago.
August, that's right.
I haven't been back to Chicago for a convention since 1968, which was a complete debacle. So it may happen again.
Well, 68. Well, it wasn't bad. 72, but someone needs to tap him, and it's not an easy thing to do, but someone needs to do it. And then, of course, we've got the prospect of, and I suspect if that happened, and that's a big if, I suspect if that happened, there would be some clear air around the Democrats for them to have a good run into the November election. But yeah, look, that's going to be the biggest story of 2024, without doubt. And it always is an election year in the United States. But this one wow, really anything can happen.
And what was the biggest story in sport? Was it the Ashes, or was it Collingwood winning a premiership and people actually being pleased for them?
Well, speak for yourself.
Or was it the Matildas? What was the biggest story in sport?
Well, I think you're missing a couple of things. I think Australia's World Cup win in India, that was an outstanding performance in front of huge audiences. So Australia became World Test champions. They held the Ashes in the UK, probably had a little bit of luck there towards the end with some rain at Old Trafford, but held the Ashes and then went on to win the World Cup in India, with India red-hot favourites. So I think the story there is that Pat Cummins is one hell of a captain. And I was just watching a little bit of a clip. When he came to the wicket, Australia needed 72 at Edgbaston, and he steered them through just ice water going through the veins. Very, very competent captain. So I think that's the story in cricket, is that Pat Cummins is one of the best captains this country has produced on form so far. Hell of a good bowler, of course, too. They have this thing now, Jack, on the Fox coverage of cricket, where they call it the hanky, but it's actually about the size of a shoebox that they basically impose on the pitch, and as a means to see how accurate the bowler is. Cummins put 6 balls in the shoebox and then came and bowled another over after that and did exactly the same thing. Staggering accuracy.
Is this called the hanky? Because Bill O'Reilly used to use the hanky to bowl into.
Yeah, and look, other players have used tea towels. I think the great Sri Lankan bowler, the quick. I'm just trying to think of his name. He used to put a couple of boots down at the other end and bowl at them.
Warnie used to bowl at a cricket ball.
Bowl a cricket ball, yeah. I mean, I haven't seen that sort of accuracy from a quick bowler, though. I mean, 12 balls all in the shoebox. Anyway, I think that's the story in cricket, that Pat Cummins is a great Australian, and we are witnessing a very, very good Australian side. Where they belong in the pantheon of it all, they're probably not as good as the Ponting, Gilchrist, Warren sides, McGrath sides. But they're coming up against just about everybody else, perhaps again with the exception of the 48 Invincibles. But yes, a very good side. Disappointing numbers at the WACA. Jack, did you see the attendance figures? They weren't good.
I didn't see the figures, but I glanced at the screen when it was on, and there didn't seem to be a lot of people there.
Well, there's a couple of things to talk about there, and one is the WACA has been redeveloped. So when we do have these smaller test series, maybe they should be playing at the WACA.
I agree. It's a much better visual to have a packed small ground than an empty large one.
Yeah, I think that the Optus Stadium holds about 60. So, maybe that's part of the issue. And maybe the WACA needs to be informed, not the ground, but the Western Australian Cricket Association needs to be informed. You need to get a few more people to test cricket, otherwise we might be playing these games in Adelaide and Hobart. And it's true that the attendance figures have been dropping off in Western Australia. But anyway, excellent year in Australian cricket. Collingwood played Brisbane in the grand final, the 2 best sides in the competition. And had a very good win. People were pleased for them because there's a different culture at that club now.
And that's a remarkable thing given the history.
They've got a good coach. They don't have loudmouth presidents. They don't walk away from some of their cultural problems. They're a good outfit, and they'll be thereabouts next year. The Blues will be coming, I'm sure of that too. They had a very good season and lots to like about the Blues. The Matildas, well, they made a semi-final, and it was great because that was an overachievement. But it belongs in the highlights of sport for the year. Didn't go all the way. A lot of nonsense about public holidays and all that sort of stuff. What it did do was create enormous television audiences, Jack. And now I'm looking at Football Australia and saying, well, what are you doing in terms of developing the game? And there's not very much. They were giving them a whole pile of money from the Albanese government, and you look around at, you know, junior soccer and women's soccer and young girls playing soccer, and there's not a lot of money being spent. So I get the impression that there's opportunities going to waste there.
Yeah, the AFL are the gold standard for a junior version of their sport.
Yes, indeed.
They could all look at that.
All right, so sport for
And
the rest.
Nathan Lyon, 500 Test wickets.
Yeah, Nathan Lyon, 500 Test wickets. I was watching a clip yesterday of him taking his first, and I think it was in India, but I could be wrong. But first ball he bowled in Test cricket, took a wicket. And I would also like to add, Jack, that Kim Hughes identified Nathan Lyon as a bowler, I think, maybe even for South Australia. And at the time, he obviously hails from New South Wales. And Kim, with his very good eye for cricket, has said Australia should be pushing him along because he believed he was a long-term star in the making.
Yeah, well,
Good eyes.
a mate said to me, he thought Nathan Lyon had got off to a slow start, so I thought I'd check that out. His first ball in Test cricket was against Sri Lanka.
Thank you.
And he rolled over Kumar Sangakkara.
That's right.
And I think
he was on a few at the time.
Yeah, and I thought, gee, that's hard to have a better start in Test cricket than at that stage. Kumar Sangakkara was in the top 3 or 4 batsmen in the world. And if you can knock him over first ball, I think that's a pretty damn good start.
Hell of a good catch. Was that Smith in the slips? It was just a hell of a good
I think it was.
left-handed catch, one-hander. So congratulations to Nathan Lyon. It is a stunning feat. He probably will get Glenn McGrath before he's done. I think got about 60-odd wickets to take there. I wouldn't think, catch Warner. He is 36. Can you think of a lonelier time, by the way, than Mitchell Johnson on the Triple M cricket call, watching David Warner belt 165 over 2.5 sessions? That must have been a difficult time for him.
I'm sure it would have galled a bit.
It didn't let on. There was Brayshaw there giving him a bit of niggle, and he said, Mitch, what have you been up to? You been up to anything? Yeah. And Johnson wasn't biting. He said, it's lovely in Perth, beautiful weather, all that sort of stuff. And, no, you say you haven't been up to anything at all. And this is while Warner was making runs for fun. So my question is, Jack, Dave now definitely goes out in the third test against Pakistan in Sydney.
He probably does.
Which is the way he would have chosen to go. And where does he belong in the pantheon of cricketers, Australian cricketers?
Looking at openers, he's probably behind Matthew Hayden.
I mean, he's made more runs than Hayden in fewer tests. The problem is he's made about 70% of his runs in Australia. And he doesn't have 100 in India, he doesn't have 100 in England. And his averages are pretty low there. All of that's a bit remarkable because he makes runs in ODI and T20 cricket in India easily. But in Test cricket, not so much. He has, I forget who he had covered. He passed a number of very great players. I think probably his greatest sort of contribution to Australian cricket is the way he plays, and Australia will and cricket fans in general will notice that he's not playing because let's say Matt Renshaw or a Cameron Bancroft come into the side and open the batting for Australia against the West Indies. They won't have that person who can actually win you a test match really in the first session of a day. If Dave Warner gets a pretty quick 500, then it opens the door for Australia to make 400. And if Australia make 400 batting first, they don't get beaten. So I think that's the main. Look, if Warner makes runs, Australia wins. And that doesn't mean if he doesn't make runs, they don't win. But if he makes runs and the manner in which he makes them and the speed in which he makes them, that sets up an Australian victory virtually every time. And we're going to miss him, and it will be palpable by the time we get into some very serious cricket against India next year in Australia, and then England after that. I think he belongs really up there. Yeah, I'd certainly put him alongside Matt Hayden. Matt Hayden made runs in India, made runs in England, made runs kind of comprehensively all over the place. And Warner's perhaps been a really strong contributor in Australia and perhaps less so elsewhere. But a fantastic cricketer in all forms. Wish him well for the last couple of tests. What do you got to take us out, Jack?
Firstly, two things from Twitter. The first one was a photo from Perth during the Test match. It was a selfie taken by Wazim Akran. They're doing the morning walk before they head off to the ground and do commentary. In the photo were Wazim himself, Michael Vaughan, Mark Waugh and Ravi Shastri, and I thought, gee, that's a good photo.
Yeah, well, they're in the Fox team, and Shastri kind of can be a bit formal, and Wazim Akram's a great commentator. I mean, he's a great cricketer, of course, but he's a wonderful commentator, and he's had to sit there with the head in the hands a fair bit when catches have gone down and blokes have got out. And you suspect that when Babar Azam gets out fairly cheaply in Pakistan, the heads go down in the dressing room a bit. But they got some work to do. One of the things I loved seeing, Jack, was Mitchell Marsh was named man of the match. Got that ahead of Dave Warner, got a 90, and then got 60 odd in the second dig, I think, and took a few wickets with the ball.
And importantly, only took one wicket in the first innings, but it was Babar Azam.
It was Babar, yeah. So, and when he got the medal, he walked off the ground, pulled it off his head, and gave it to one of the kids. It was a lovely thing to do, and that kid will be hanging on to that for the rest of his life. Yeah, looks like a really fine man, does Mitch Marsh. The Pakistan side. What do we make of their performance before you go, Jack?
Well, I think we said last week that there is a fair gap between their best and their worst, and this was far from their best.
It was really hard because by the time they got to bat, Australia struggled in the second innings too against an attack that's part of the problem with Pakistan. Their quickest bowler bowls 130. He's normally quicker than that, but he's bowling sort of within himself, possibly injured. And then there's a fairly young attack that's sort of fairly moderate speeds in the 120s. And then when they got to bat in the fourth dig, up against the best attack in the world with Stark, Cummins and Hazelwood and Lyon, of course, the wicket was really misbehaving. So Bubba and one of the other key bats, they got out basically gloving balls while they were, on playing front foot shots. So that was telling you the wicket was misbehaving, and against that attack, they really didn't stand a chance. So it's a bit sad, but again, there have to be some questions asked from the whacker, or so not the whacker, but the curator at the ground there, that perhaps she gave a little bit too much assistance to the bowling side in that final innings.
It did.
All right.
And the last thing,
Yep.
Again from Twitter, there are some little gems on Twitter. Someone posted a little puzzle there asking what was the best smart fitness watch to wear for exercise. And the response I liked was a Patek Philippe Nautilus. Go for a run in South London. Believe me, you won't stop.
You won't be allowed to stop. Otherwise, you'll be losing the watch.
And the further response was, the marketing spiel, you never really own a Patek Philippe, is never more true than when getting flash mobbed on Peckham High Street.
There you go. Very good stuff. All right, listeners, that takes us out for the year, for this show and for the year. We're probably going to take a couple of weeks off. We'll talk about that. And we'll have a couple of weeks off, and we'll be back to you in January. So, in the meantime, let me give you the woke version. Happy holidays, and be safe. I was talking to a mate of mine from a prominent bank and they had a end of year celebration, Jack, and the word Christmas was not mentioned, which is very odd.
And the city of Stonington were calling it "Have a Merry Time" or something. Christmas was no longer to be used.
It's okay to say Christmas, and really, it's Christmas all the way around the world, regardless of what religion is predominant in whatever country they're in. So, yes, it's okay. It's okay to say Christmas. You're not offending anybody.
Yeah, well, the Cantonese locals here mightn't be believers, but they're happy to have Christmas.
They use the term Christmas, Jack?
Oh, absolutely.
There you go. Well,
you can't go into a shop without being having Christmas carols played.
Lovely. Well, you enjoy all of that, Jack, and catching up with family on the Boxing Day, eye on the cricket, no doubt, and we wish our listeners every joy over the Christmas period, and enjoy your holidays, your time off, and we look forward to catching up with you in the new year. Cheers. See ya.